Welcome to the Cycling Performance Podcast, presented by Team EF Coaching, where we explore the intersection between the science of sport and the art of balance, human behavior, and sustainable performance on and off the bike. Hi again, everybody, and thanks to all of our wonderful listeners at the Cycling Performance Podcast. I am Nathan Haas, co-director at Team EF Coaching, and our co-host.
I'm Colby Pearce.
We're very excited to have a very interesting guest with us today, somebody who I've heard quite a lot about and looking forward to the conversation is Professor Kerry McGawley. I just asked before if introducing her as Professor is the right term.
She said yes.
She said yes. She said technically that's true. So I'll let you elaborate on that a little bit, Kerry.
Yeah, well, with a caveat that that's technically, as you say, correct and accurate. It's not what all of my friends call me. But yeah, Kerry's fine for the rest of the discussion. But thanks so much for having me on. I'm looking forward to, where this discussion is going to take us.
Yeah, so, one of our methods as coaches is not to pretend that we know everything. I think there's a limit to anybody's knowledge, and I think a certain aspect of that can also be through limited experience. And one thing neither Colby or myself have any experience is being a woman. So we don't want to, by any means, come across in any education into the cycling sphere as all knowledgeable in the case of women's health in sport, and in particular around the topic of optimizing performance, health, and happiness, working with the menstrual cycle. So we were hoping today for you to not only educate us, but also our listeners on all the sort of years of study that you've done into this area. And we'd just like to probably at different points prod and poke around different aspects of what you're saying, so we can try to take it as far as we can today. But we would love to hear from you, and I guess we can start off by asking you a little bit about your own background academically, and also what I see is actually quite an amazing career yourself in triathlon.
Yeah, thanks for that. I really like, the way that you're kind of putting this health approach first, but also acknowledging the fact, which I've come across a lot of coaches over the years who don't necessarily acknowledge immediately that they don't know everything. And actually, if you sort of research into the field of being a coach and expertise within coaching, it's something that I've read quite a bit about that coaches really grapple with, is that there is an expectation on them, actually, often times from the field that they function within and from the athletes, that they are supposed to know everything. And I think that's really reflected in this field, where predominantly coaches are men across pretty much all sports, particularly cycling as well will not be different from that. And the fact that, like you said, you guys are men and therefore don't have any personal experience of the menstrual cycle, but also just because I'm a woman, or just because any other coach might be a woman, they actually only have themselves as a case study as well. So we can't expect women coaches or female coaches either to be experts in this field, because it's just another component of performance that we have to learn a lot about, regardless of our own sex and gender. But definitely we see, not in all athlete cohorts, but having done a lot of work with elite high performance athletes, there's a tendency that they'll prefer to kind of communicate and talk to female coaches or women in this space, but that's not always the case. We have examples of female athletes having really good coach-athlete relationships with their male coaches, not having a problem to talk about this, but still potentially having some troubles just with a lack of knowledge on both sides. But I've kind of jumped the gun with all of that, so we'll see where that ends up in the conversation. Because if I kind of come back just to really briefly about myself, academia, I'm now a full professor in sports science. I work at a university in Sweden, Mid-Sweden University. I also work as a consultant with a sports science and kind of biomarker AI technology company, Orico, and we work worldwide with lots of different sports, male and female team sports, individual sports. And I run the kind of female health program within that company as well. So I've got quite a bit of applied experience. I haven't always studied this particular field. I've always worked with high performance athletes. Up in Sweden, I spent a lot of time working in cross country skiing and winter biathlon. So also similar to your worlds actually of endurance sport, individual sports. There's quite a lot of crossover, I would say, between cycling and those worlds of cross country and biathlon. Very integrated from a sex perspective. The athletes compete at the same time. They do the same races, the same competitions at the same places at the same time. They'll go on camp oftentimes together. So it's actually quite interesting in that it's a very integrated sport, and that makes it feel quite modern in a way, and also nice for us women kind of working in it. And yeah, in terms of triathlon, I mean, I got into that a little bit later in life, like around kind of in my 30s. I grew up playing soccer, playing football at that time in kind of the highest leagues that we had, but that was like the late 90s. So there was no professional soccer back in those days. So I've experienced real disparity in kind of sex or gender-based discrimination in sports. Something like soccer, it's just massive. Still, it's massive. But yeah, then I was just always the kind of player that won the beep test and wasn't very technically talented. So I kind of got into endurance sport, and yeah, I kind of got into doing, I guess, age group racing, particularly middle distance. And then, yeah, that's where I had I've had a few kind of accolades, I guess, in middle distance triathlon racing, but at master's level.
You're underselling it. I'll just jump in and say Kerry's won the 70.3 World Championships in her age group, so that is no small feat for sure.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, very impressive. Very impressive. You said a few things in this opening statement. There was quite a few layers to it. But one of the points that I think sort of, prompted conversation for me is, yeah, there is a lot of male coaches in all sports, which to me was, definitely something to overcome when I first started coaching female athletes for the first time. Understanding that there is a difference, but also at the same time, I was quite unsure how to approach that difference. And actually, the question also was, is there a difference? Should I approach this differently? Should my coaching style differ? Should my communication style differ? And what I came to after not long actually was that where it differs is that every individual athlete deserves their own individual approach as a coach. Your relationship is inherently different with every human you meet. So for me, and I would love you to tell me if I'm wrong, is that I've actually sort of approached speaking to my female athletes with absolutely no difference other than the fact that I treat everybody at a very individual level as a coach. Where I have struggled as a coach is actually asking people with the right language, how do you breach the subject of, the menstrual cycle, and how do you communicate in a sense that actually promotes open, honest conversation, whilst also trying to learn from them when I, again, still have quite a limited understanding of the experience. So I guess I would love to hear from you, just to really kick things off. And this isn't to say that I have no knowledge on, how the different phases work, how different women feel, in different phases. How we approach this is also from like a nutrition perspective, a training load perspective. But one of my initial challenge was actually, how do we talk about this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and actually, it's something that we've been doing quite a lot of like direct research in around and kind of original sort of research. I've got a PhD student up in Sweden. She works alongside the Cross Country Ski Federation. And so the first study that we did there was looking at kind of communication about the menstrual cycle in the senior women's team, so kind of our elite Olympic squad. And something that came up a lot there was that they really didn't talk to their coaches very much at all about these issues, well, about their menstrual cycles and how that might affect performance, how it affects them personally, how they might, I don't know, adapt their training if needed, or adapt anything else if needed. Basically, the communication wasn't really happening. We had the coaches also in that study, so they kind of gave us some insights through those interviews as to kind of what it was predominantly male coaches who also again felt out of their depth, didn't want to kind of overstep barriers like personal barriers, didn't know how to breach the subject like you just said. And something that also came up was, because I think the average age of that cohort was about 26, 28 years old or something, so senior athletes, it came up time and again that they kind of needed to be talked about this when they were younger. So it's difficult if you're kind of, if you're working, well, I mean, it's not impossible at all, but I mean, if you're working with senior athletes now who hasn't had that, we can't now retrospectively change that, right? But I think in general, as a community, as a system, we need to like change that prospectively now and start kind of talking to our athletes much earlier in their careers. So something that we're doing now is working with, in Sweden, what we call gymnasium, which is like the high school system. We have like quite a well-developed academy, sort of high school system for all different sports, including cycling. And there we've been going in, and actually we broadened it from just menstrual health and the menstrual cycle to actually stigmatized health topics. And we've included the boys in that. And that includes kind of mental health, nutritional health, disordered eating, eating disorders, body image, and kind of hormonal health as well. So that's just been a really fun and very effective, I would say, sort of project. But in terms of kind of what to do about it, what we found that's really functional is that we've had sort of a mediator, a facilitator to bring together coaches and athletes, firstly separately to sort of allow them to be quite comfortable in their environments and to give them some sort of workshop education, but then like after that bringing them together, and the fact that they've got that sort of similar background from those same kind of educational workshops, they start to have similar kind of language that they can use. They know that they've heard about it in their own separate kind of cells, bring them together. And then now when we start talking about, you know, we've got a language to bring up, are they having regular periods, for example, and there's an understood and reciprocal knowledge of why that question might come from a coach, or even, you know, it might be a lot softer than that, but it will be an understanding that that's linked to my energy availability, that's linked to my overall health, they care about me, that, you know. And so, but in terms of breaking the kind of silence or breaking the ice, I think you definitely need to do purposeful sort of intervention in some way, and that doesn't necessarily require a facilitator. Like it could just be still between you and athlete, but you have to kind of purposefully think to yourself, right, how am I going to approach this? Come up with some sort of slow and steady inputs, maybe explain where those things are coming from, why you're asking those kind of questions, and start developing a common language. And we've just found that with this kind of mediator person, it takes the pressure a little bit off both sides, and it also brings in like an expert. I don't like you said from the very beginning, like a coach cannot be expected to be a very high level physiologist, a very high level psychologist, a very high level nutritionist, etc., etc. So we're bringing experts in those fields, right, to try and help out with like nutritional interventions or particular altitude training, physiology, to help us out. So I think it's not strange to think that you actually need some sort of expertise and facilitation in this field as well, because it's just another performance factor. So, I mean, that was a lot kind of around. I'm not sure if I really answered the question, but I mean, yeah, I think there does need to be kind of purposeful thought and structure about how these things are brought up with the athlete or group of athletes. And one thing that we found in our original study that I mentioned with the senior cross-country skiers was that there were no structures or forums, there were no times or places for these conversations to occur. Every day there was a training planning conversation. Every day there was some sort of recovery conversation, but there wasn't any time or place for these particular conversations. And they don't just necessarily, well, they don't just come up spontaneously.
Yeah. That's super interesting. That's a really good point, right? It's like we think about the barriers to these conversations happening, and without getting into the mechanics of this workshop that you've described too much, like I can imagine that for a male, there's the barrier of, first of all, using the right language, right? And then there's the challenge of perceived expertise, which you just outlined really, really effectively. Like, I do think there's a culture in cycling, probably in lots of sports, where the athlete perceives the coach as being the expert, right? And I was listening to you on another podcast recently, and you mentioned one of the first things you said that really struck me was, look, I'm a coach and I'm an athlete and I'm also a sports physiologist, but I don't proclaim to know what's going to make any athlete better. I think that was a non-trivial statement you made. That's super important. It's so common for athletes to go to a coach and expect them to have all this expertise. And it's really no different. Like a coach may have more experience training an athlete and talking about what types of intervals they want to give them to break down the demands of their race or whatever kind of methodology they're using. But ultimately, we can't know everything. Knowledge is horizontal, right? So when we kind of level the playing field from that perspective and offer that a coach is learning, they're more of a guide than the endpoint expert, the lab coat expert, or however you want to phrase it. That can open the door and hopefully take down the barrier between that level of conversation. We just have that level of honesty. Like, look, I'm here to guide you on this process. I'm learning also. And the essence is not that a coach will know, everything at some point, that they'll be way up here in terms of knowledge, have all the studies and all the information and all the science behind them, and the athlete is way down here and we're bringing them up to that level. It's more like, in my perspective, the way I conceptualize it is the coach simply has more experience and expertise in many areas, and we're here to offer that to the athlete. And as long as the athlete's learning and advancing and we're learning together, then we're accomplishing the goal. We're moving towards the end point.
And I was
Please.
just going to follow up that and say, like, it's so refreshing these days. Like, there's so many more. Like like I said, kind of a bit earlier on, I felt historically that there's been a lot of coaches who felt that they have to be the oracle, and therefore they've shut. They've really closed down the doors and not let anybody in because of it's kind of an insecurity, right? And now, like, it's just so fun that there's so many. Well, oftentimes ex-elite athletes, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, but really good coaches who have got kind of an athletic background and who now have all the tools available to them to sort of learn a lot of sports science, or they're integrating themselves with a lot of like expert sports science. And I think the same with the sports scientists. They're integrating themselves really well into like coaching practice. They might have an athletic background, or they're immersing themselves into that world as well. So I think like we're getting really strong quite quickly now at that sort of triangulation between athlete, coach, and sort of scientist or expert, which is really like exciting for the future. There was one other thing you said there, and Nathan, you might have had a question as well, but there was one other thing that we can come back to as well. We recently did a study, and it was a qualitative kind of interview study where we did a sort of pre-survey to find very high performing, so international level athletes, endurance athletes who suffered from or kind of experienced at least 2 severely rated negative menstrual cycle symptoms, because some athletes really don't have an issue, right? And other athletes really have quite big issues. And it's exactly like you said earlier, Nathan, you've got to like work with the individual's like situation that you're faced with. So we tried to sort of identify some who really do have these troubles, and interviewed them and really got into the nitty-gritty of what their menstrual cycle symptom management processes are about, because that's the kind of point that we've got to in the research now. We know that loads of athletes suffer with lots of negative symptoms that affects their training and their perceived performance, sometimes their actual performance too. But we haven't really got any tools to solve these issues. There's very little out there in terms of what to actually do in practice. So anyway, the point, I can come back to more details on that if it's interesting, but we had actually 4 cyclists out of the cohort of 9 or 10 athletes in that study. So we got some really nice insights from kind of tour riders and things who are out on the bike for hours and hours and hours. But one thing that came up a couple of times from cycling was that, and from some of the other athletes, was that they actually don't have trouble to talk to their male coaches about these things, and their male coaches are not having trouble kind of talking to them about it either. But then very quickly the conversation is kind of stopped. There's a barrier to how far that conversation is going, because neither of them have got any more, like, yeah, she can share her sort of experiences, the coach can say, yeah, I really want to be able to help you, but we just haven't got these good systems for like next steps beyond that. So it's not always about not being able to talk about it, even if that is in place, it's still kind of not getting solved.
We need more
So,
depth in the conversation.
yeah. So you bring up the point of how successful a mediator can be in difficult conversations, and both the technique that both Colby and I use for a lot of our athletes, which is kind of like a form of digital mediator, is we actually love to share our findings from other people. And one of the ways I think is very effective, I think definitely sort of in like sort of this generation and digital era, is people seem to digest very well information from podcasts. So Colby and I share a lot of podcasts, sometimes even just to sort of drop an idea into an athlete to open their mind to a greater conversation that we can have together later, where they actually want to learn more from us. And again, if there is like a knowledge lack, we will also send them on to more findings and help them with the research process. We both love doing research. But I think this leads to, a very healthy place for the conversation to go, is that I would ultimately love this conversation to also be something that, our listeners can see as a form of mediation between the conversation. And you bring up the concept of negative menstrual symptoms. I would love you to deep dive into that, because we don't want to go too much on the surface here. We would like to get stuck into the things that, potentially there's some female athletes out there that are suffering from these symptoms, and they think that they're a very normal part and just, a universal experience for everybody. And maybe they are, maybe they're not. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and knowledge and understanding of this.
Yeah, sure. And it's really interesting you say that, because it's something that I hadn't really considered. We had a conversation with an athlete from another sport a few weeks ago, and we were kind of presenting information, trying to help them through sort of their particular situation. And the coach was in as well. And he asked for the same thing. It was like, oh, could you share sort of the symptoms with us? And to me, maybe it's just because I work in this field, but it seemed like such a obvious thing to me, that everybody would know all the possible symptoms, like female people, like women, female athletes themselves included. So yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because I've kind of heard that before. But yeah, we can definitely do that. I'm just going to pause talking for 2 seconds, because I just like this study that we did, and I just want to be quite concise about talking about. So hopefully this is kind of all to cut out, so I can be a bit more specific and concise when it comes to it. Maybe I can find this thing quickly. I probably don't need to do this because I've got so much in my mind. Maybe I just need a. Sorry, I will. Oh, I won't do that. Right, I'll just go off. Right, sorry. I just wanted to be a bit concise. Yeah, and the reason that I kind of highlighted negative symptoms. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, you can hear me all right.
You're catching up
Sorry.
a bit.
Okay. The reason that I specified negative menstrual cycle symptoms is because there's a lot of chat, I guess, in the literature that symptoms could be both positive and negative. And if you look at apps that are out there and exist, oftentimes they might have things on the list like happy, energized, confident, motivated, things that are actually positive. And I think that's really nice, useful information to collect when we're collecting kind of menstrual cycle symptom tracking across the course of a cycle, because then you can kind of start to see the patterns of when particular athletes are feeling particularly more positive or better within their cycles, and not having it just as a kind of negative talking point all the time. But if we do come back to the negative ones, I mean, there's just really common ones, right? Like bloating is really common, back pain, breast pain. Breast pain seems to be a little bit less common in female athletes, and it's probably related to kind of the amount of breast tissue that they have. But it still does come up for sure. And we had an interesting insight from, actually it was a winter biathlete, because they shoot on their front, right? They lie down in a supine position and shoot. And that was really troubling her when she was having severe breast pain, being in the supine position and shooting. Yeah, back pain, headaches, migraines, lots of them are like psychological as well, mood related. And lots of them can be social as well. So they kind of need to, you know, really save their social battery, or they need to. So we've had athletes talk about how they need to just delete everything from their calendar in all of their downtime and off time, because they just need to like be much lower in those kind of times, in terms of that kind of incoming social stimuli. So, yeah, there's a nice study from a colleague of mine, Guru Stramsoli. They kind of have got a really nice figure in there, and I can send it on to you guys as well, that they've kind of listed around, I don't know, 10 or 12 like common symptoms that came up, and show how common they were across their like 140 athletes in that paper, across 4 different like phases of the menstrual cycle. So during the bleed, later in that follicular phase, earlier in the luteal phase, and then premenstrually. So that's kind of nice. And you'll see that like the majority of the negative symptoms spike up premenstrually and during the bleed. Bleeding itself is also considered a symptom. I mean, obviously it's going to be a natural process of that menstruation, but the bleed itself is, and I think this is really important for athletes and coaches to understand, the bleed itself looks very, very different, right, for every individual person. It lasts for a different number of days. The heaviness is completely different. We've also just been doing a study now looking at, because most studies are just like snapshots, cross-sectional. They just look at one cycle, and then they'll kind of describe what a cycle looks like. We've just had kind of well-trained athletes in lots of different sports as well, and followed them during their bleed phase across kind of 4 cycles, just to start to, I mean, it's just early days because there's nothing on this. What's the sort of variability? How are they experiencing their menstruation from cycle to cycle? Because I think that's something that we also need to be aware of. Just because we've got a symptom management strategy one time, we might need different ones in the future. That said, it's fairly stable what types of symptoms individuals appear to experience. It's somewhat stable as to whether you experience lots of negative symptoms or don't. But those kind of things do also change, like over the course of the lifespan, and even within that period of time, being an elite athlete, from being younger to being more senior. I think the other thing to mention is, so far we've really only mentioned the words kind of menstrual cycle and talking about the bleeding from that perspective. Obviously, lots and lots of athletes are using hormonal contraception. Female athletes, that means that they have a sort of withdrawal bleed. They're not having the same natural endogenous hormonal fluctuations that you would have if you're not using hormonal contraception. And there's quite a few things like wrapped into that, because if you were not having sort of good, healthy, natural menstrual cycles, you obviously are kind of masking that by use of hormonal contraception, and it's still just really quickly prescribed by doctors, by medical clinicians, and they don't necessarily consider that athlete population or specific individual needs. But it's often used to manage symptoms, to manipulate bleeds when the bleeds are occurring, to manage the amount of bleeding. But I think there's quite a lot that athletes should consider and talk to coaches or other medical experts or people who understand that kind of world a lot more before just jumping on something, particularly at an early age. So it's really common that, you know, young girls might start to bleed a lot, or they're getting a lot of negative symptoms when they first start getting their period. Obviously, we want them to stay in sport. We want them to be comfortable doing their sport, but there are other solutions than just jumping on the pill, because then you really have quite poor knowledge of their sort of hormonal health status, like for the next 10 years, if they stay on the pill for the next 10 years. So there's lots kind of wrapped into that. But I mean, I can definitely be more specific and share some resources around, like, you know, common menstrual cycle symptoms that we experience. But nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, like lots of things like that are also common.
Wow. Yeah. Thank
So
you. That's helpful.
yeah, that's a fantastic sort of preliminary description. I'm sure there's a lot of literature out there to give us more information, which if you would like to share it with us, we'd also love to share it to our listeners as well. Um, but you mentioned that there's very few things or very few solutions to these negative symptoms. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are then for how coaches um, take these into account and strategies to kind of optimize training in and around the periods of time that people are facing negative symptoms from their cycle.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I even mentioned like menstrual cramps, but that's typically the most common one overall. So if I didn't mention that, God, I'm sorry, because like, and if you do suffer from those, they can be quite debilitating, and I might have forgotten to. But yeah, that study that we just did with where we interviewed those sort of 9, 10 like really high performance endurance athletes, there we came up, we heard about lots of different strategies that they're using. Lots and lots of them are just trial and error, though, and it's chatting to parents, mothers, aunts, friends, peers, other athletes. But it's just kind of, yeah, somewhat hocus pocus. Like one of the quotes in that study is, I went to my gynecologist and she told me to take some herbs, which is like comical if it's not sort of like really quite scary. But I mean, there's lots of like things quoted in that study is like there's no scientific underpinning to this at all. But I think like in terms of what we can do, and there is a lot, and I think there's lots of ideas even in that paper that come up. But the first thing to do is get a database, right? Get some information. So I think the first thing to do is start the conversation. So we need to start up the conversation. Do you experience anything around your menstrual cycles that we might be able to support you with in terms of your training and health and happiness? So I think starting the conversation to see whether the athlete is going to kind of be engaged in that type of process, because we've got to remember that this is, athletes sharing their own personal data and information, which they might not be happy to do. And there's quite a few studies about tracking and apps and athletes being quite worried about where that data is stored, how it's stored, who's got access to it, etc. So I think it's about helping them to find a good way for them to start recording that information if that's what they're keen to do and interested to do. And it will support their performance, particularly if they're experiencing anything negative. So hopefully they're going to be engaged in that process. Then it's about sort of getting a database for them, so starting to try and see what things are affecting them. Is it the same kind of things all the time? And then you can start to match up with those particular symptoms, potential like symptom management strategies. And we've had athletes kind of, let's say high power athletes, you might have sprinters or track cyclists, who really struggle to do max power or max strength kind of gym sessions, for example, on certain days because they suffer from really bad back pain, really bad stomach cramps. So it might be as simple as, and it's funny that like the data shows that almost nobody is adapting or altering their training programs around their symptoms. And I get that it's really tricky, right? Because there's so many moving parts, there's so much going on, particularly in like things like team sports. We do a lot of work with soccer, let's say, and they need to be kind of doing things together. But even on, cycling training camps, everyone's out on the rides together. There's also the psychosocial aspect that no athlete wants to come across as weak, right? They don't want to kind of admit to any weakness or acknowledge any weakness or talk about it. They don't want to kind of appear like that. And that's not a negative. I mean, that's part of who they are and how they kind of actually can be exceptional. So that kind of resilience stops them also bringing these things up and talking about it. But if you can kind of get through to individuals that this really can, support their performance and health, and if there are certain things that you can tweak and manage around particular types of symptoms, then that's what you can start to implement. And that can, this does not have to be rocket science. It doesn't have to take over. Well, it certainly shouldn't take over the whole training program. But at the minute, I think it's a whole black hole that we're just literally like not open, or like a can of worms that we're not opening up, or kind of black hole that we're not looking into. So I think you just need to identify which athletes actually might are prepared to kind of do this process. What are the kind of things that they're experiencing and suffering from, and what are actual practical things that we can do about this? And there is more and more coming out in the literature around that. But if we can get specific about it as well, if you'd like to kind of get more into that.
I think what you what you just said, what you just highlighted there is also worth repeating, which is I got hung up on the stigmatization of the idea that athletes have this persona that they need to be durable or tough or deal with pain and discomfort. And this is something I approach with my athletes all the time because for me, what I found in my own experiences as an athlete and also with everyone that I coach without exception is that everyone has their limit. So the entire art of training is looking at the objective data and the subjective data and trying to find that middle ground, right? We're trying to apply the appropriate dose of training, not just load someone to maximum all the time. If loading to maximum all the time was the optimal load for everyone, then we would just, David Goggins everyone to death and give them, 500 squats every single day forever. And, who cares if they've ripped their ACL in half or whatever. So I think that's an important part to acknowledge is that if an athlete, in particular a female athlete, perceives that they'll be, or they fear perhaps that they'll be perceived as weak if they talk about their menstrual symptoms or they're talking about cramping or low back pain, and they have a bit of inhibition about approaching their coach in this topic and saying, look, this just probably isn't the best move for me to go strength training next Tuesday because, it's Sunday and my cycle's coming. I can tell things are not going to go well. Let's just move things. I think that's just an honest conversation. So I guess I'm just planting a flag in the sand there and hoping that if anything from this conversation, some of our athletes take away the willingness to have these open discussions with their coaches, right? And be more forward about it. I think that's important. It's very rare that we can just load an athlete infinitely. Almost never, right? I mean, we never can.
That's the black swan event, and those athletes, ironically, are hitting an incredible outcome rate, but actually in spite of actually still not doing what is ideal for them. And this is what I think happens a lot in many sports is that there's just some people with some born natural ability, be it that they're just endocrinal freaks, that they can create a lot of recovery hormones, or, they've just got the perfect biomechanics or VO2 capacity. There's all these different things that can create a freak. But for the most part, most athletes are not that athlete. But something I actually feel as I'm moving more into, my coaching journey, Colby's been at coaching for a lot longer than I have, but I've always felt that as a coach, I always relish in the moment that an athlete actually messages me and says, "Today doesn't feel right," or, this particular schedule in my life, I tend not to have a great Tuesday on the bike, and I say, thank you for telling me this. Like, this is really helpful. I know timing wise, Tuesday would be a great day for us to do these efforts, but I prefer to actually know what's not good for your own ebbs and flows. Pardon the pun here, but everything in life has ebbs and flows. Whether that's relationships, whether that's work, whether that's study, whether that's also how we interact with different seasons. There's definitely some athletes that can start the season really well, but some others take longer. Some like summer, some don't like autumn. Randomly, some athletes don't do well on a full moon, or they do fantastically on a full moon. But it's the more athletes look inward and actually start to intuit how they're feeling. When they do that, for me as a coach, I love these moments because I'm learning more about them so that I can actually serve them better. But to kind of link that point is, I have a female athlete who I'm sure would be fine for me to mention this without naming her. She was traveling to one of her big goal races for the entire year, and she was basically on borderline anxious because she was like, "Oh my gosh, I haven't got my period yet. Oh my gosh, I haven't got my period yet." And I'm asking her, where does this sort of fit into everything now? Like, what's bringing you the anxiety? And she says, I don't perform well until my cycle actually begins. Sorry, not my cycle, but my bleed begins. And at that point, I'm fantastic, which for me was interesting on two levels, because I had heard from other female athletes that was actually the point that they felt the worst. Whereas in her case, it was when she felt the best and she actually looked forward to it. But it brings up the second question of that is how how do female athletes approach, and also how do coaches approach this topic, where there might be some genuine anxiety that the wrong time of the cycle lands exactly on their goal sporting event? And how do we overcome that from a psychological level and also a symptoms level?
I think there's a lot there. And I mean, I guess in that particular example, first of all, I mean, some of that's psychologist work and mindset and having psychological strategies, I would say. And I'm not a psychologist, but obviously I've worked with psychologists and kind of seen various strategies that are in play. But I would definitely think, I think one of the, before we go on with that, I think one of the other parts is looking into whether she just perceives her performance to be worse or whether her performance actually is worse, because they're two quite different things. And lots of the literature will show that. So if you take a whole big group, performance is typically perceived to be worse and fitness is typically perceived to be worse premenstrually and during the bleed. So aligned with when the symptoms are kind of worst as well. And then in the middle of the cycle, perceived to be best, fitness is perceived to be best. But in a large cohort of athletes, you're going to still get variation, right? But there's significant differences there at a group level. But like you said, some athletes, it's that moment that the bleed starts, that the anxiety, they can kind of exhale, right? Just breathe out. Oh my God, thank goodness for that. Now I'm fine. Others actually suffer through the actual bleed because they have severe cramps. There's a lot of blood. They're losing a lot of blood and they're still experiencing a lot of symptoms. So like you said, like it's different for everyone and you need to get that information. But if I start by saying there's nothing you can do about it, I mean, there is some things you can do about it. And that's oftentimes why the pill is used, right? Because people will actually, like, firstly, it might reduce the impact of the symptoms, but secondly, you can sort of manipulate it using timings of when you take that pill as to when you get that withdrawal bleed. That's definitely not something that I or we as a group, when I work with my colleagues, would offer up as a like first port of call by any stretch. I think first of all you try and work with that individual around the natural kind of experiences that they're having. So first of all, is this more perception or is it more a reality? Can we do some sort of simple field-based tests? Can we and obviously you need to be a bit careful there because you want to instill confidence, right? So you don't want to kind of you don't want to validate their feelings and say, oh my God, yeah, your power output is absolutely horrible. And those, I mean, I guess you've got power. I guess you can do these analysis like immediately. So the question is performance actually different? Are they seeing that? If it is, what can we do in training? So like we said before, we might avoid doing certain types of training because we're experiencing symptoms that's making that training not very effective. Can we actually do certain types of training on those worst days so that that kind of psychological mindset or even physiologically we're actually more able to perform nevertheless despite that kind of situation? So can we actually start to do and it's not like you might not be able to face doing that every single cycle every single month, but can we periodize when we're actually doing our really hard work through those hard times so that you approach a race, it's like I've got this now and I'm confident because yeah, I feel like crap. I know that my performance has historically been worse, but I've been working really hard and now I can produce the same power on those days as I can on any other days. You know what I mean? So I think there's sort of different approaches, but I would start with the mindset approach and the natural approach of, right, you're one of the best cyclists there is on the planet. Let's work around this and manipulate our training and our psychology to make this a great day just as the same as any other day of the cycle. But again, it always comes back to collecting that database of information so that these things are not popping up out of the blue the day before a race and being like, oh my God, I haven't had my period. It might come tomorrow. I've got the biggest race of this period of the calendar. This is a disaster. That's obviously the last thing you want to be happening, regardless of what the scenario is. Just to wrap it up, there was one other thing that popped up well, there's lots of things, but it was really nice to have, for this conversation, having cyclists in that in-depth kind of qualitative study that we did, because one of the things that came up was one of the athletes said she's a really, really heavy bleeder. And one of the challenges that she experienced was, you guys are on the bikes for hours and hours and hours, and like, if you haven't got that kind of structure, I mean, you were talking about a race, but even thinking about training, that structure to be able to stop to change like a tampon, for example. So she's like, I just put in the absolute biggest tampon I can get my hands on when I'm on training camp. I put it in like just before we're about to step out the door. But what can I do for, I've got a ride now for 6 hours. Then we're all getting on a bus. I'm still like bleeding. Like, it's embarrassing. Like, no one's letting it, we can't stop. And it wasn't negative, like my team's not letting me, but it just doesn't happen because you guys never had to do that, right? And if you need to go for a wee, maybe you just do that on the fly, fine. But I mean, would any girl consider staying on her bike, getting handed a tampon and changing it during a training ride on camp? Probably not. Is it so bad? No, I don't think so. If it was normalized, it's not that bad, maybe. I mean, you don't want it on camera, right? But I
Right.
mean, it's not the end of the world. It's just a natural process. I'm not in cycling, by the way. I'm not working it, so I'd be intrigued to know whether some of the girls are actually doing that. But to me, it's not that wild. Well, it's not wild.
So I think you hit on 2 points before that I would like to quickly touch before Colby jumps in. I know he's percolating over there. The first word is normalized, and I think that this is, and unfortunately, I do believe that the stigma around it for women is not 100% born from the stigma between women. Absolutely not. I think a lot of the stigma is that this is not normalized between men. And I think, there's also a lot of forum for men to be, hearing these kinds of conversations to actually understand exactly how normal it is. It's the very essence of life. And, it's a beautiful thing when we acknowledge it for what it is. And we certainly shouldn't see this is like a hardship or an awkward situation if a woman does actually need to stop to change a tampon in an event. I think logistically it might be a little bit hard during a bike race. I could imagine. Again, don't know from experience. But yeah, I think normalizing these conversations for everybody's sake is a really important thing. But the second thing that I would like to bring back on what you said is changing the approach. We had a guest on the podcast a few episodes ago who actually looked at the tapering process before a race, like landing a plane. We all know how to get the plane up, and we think a lot about how we fly the plane and we do all this stuff, but actually where we're very limited in our knowledge and understanding is actually how we land the plane perfectly each time for an event. Athletes, generally speaking, but definitely for cyclists, like to land the plane pretty hard. They don't like to let off the gas really until that final moment. They're basically doing like a dive bomb landing. Maybe they've even got their wheels down, hopefully. But from what it sounds to me is that if we do have a female athlete and we are having this open conversation and we're aware of their cycles and the changes in the cycles and we have the data and we have some more idea of what we're doing, a less aggressive landing would probably be the best way for us to approach this, which is to say we can't be too low for too long. Otherwise, there's lots of physiological changes that we don't want to have happen before a race. That's a bad landing. But my overall takeaway from you so far from this conversation is that the more that we are talking about this and normalize this conversation and create these forums or mediation events with mediators, the better off we are going to be as coaches to be able to just pass on our understanding and experience from a coaching perspective with them individually.
Yeah, and also sharing experiences, right? Because like we've talked about, everyone's having different experiences, and historically on these kind of things, like back from the olden days, like we got our ideas from our elders, like the elder women, like in the family tree or whatever it might be within our communities. But these girls, like now, like we're more and more kind of isolated. These are not the kind of things that are necessarily coming up on social media, so that's not where these experiences are really being openly shared. So I think like shared experiences, because I think the real world of elite women's sport is going to have to inform science on this. And that's why we did the study the way round that we did it. We didn't come flying in thinking, right, we're going to do the best ever menstrual cycle symptom management intervention, because we've got no idea like what they're doing, what their needs are. So we kind of started trying to collect or analyze the needs from the real world. So I think all those different girls in those environments, like we've brought in as well, like the younger ones in with the older ones, so that the younger ones can start like learning from the older ones. We need to share those experiences. You guys, obviously, as coaches within your environments, can do your own unpublished but scientific kind of studies of like, okay, what's working as kind of management strategies. We haven't touched on sort of nutritional interventions to try to manage the inflammatory process that kind of menstruation is, but there's lots of little things that can potentially be done there as well. Lots of other kind of minor like physiological things, just even managing heat, with temperature fluctuations being quite actually significant for some individuals throughout their cycle. So lots of like different bits and pieces there, but yeah, like, so exactly, just kind of confirming what you're saying, really sharing experiences, learning from each other, but then trying to sciencify it, you know, in some way, whether that's internally or through the literature. But I definitely think that, you know, the studies that we do on this can start to get better and better, and then we can start to identify actually useful strategies that are not just pharmacological as well. Because a lot of athletes, their other like main go-to is to use paracetamol or kind of anti-inflammatory type of drugs. Just over-the-counter kind of drugs is really common, which is, yeah, maybe that's okay from time to time, but there's probably there are other things that we can do in practice as well, behavioral things. But yeah, sorry, I'm sure Colby, you've got other things to come in with as well, experiences.
Well, yeah, thinking about what you just said there, I could see how, you know, in the context of this entire conversation, a coach or maybe an athlete might begin to feel perhaps a bit overwhelmed, because there's a lot going on here, right? As you mentioned, pain, discomfort, temperature regulation, practical things, and starting to unpack that. But I would remind everyone to zoom out and consider that really, as coaches, fundamentally what we're dealing with is a black box problem, right? We're putting inputs into an athlete's training structure. We're making interventions into what is fundamentally a complex system, right? An analogy, or not even an analogy, but a model that I like to remind people about is that athletes are kind of like three-body problems, right? If someone's not familiar with that concept, it's the idea that if we have three bodies that are interacting in a gravitational field over a long enough timeline, even the most insanely sophisticated computer model cannot predict how those three bodies will interact with each other. The model breaks down at a certain point. And that's how I view an athlete. They're just a three-body problem. Like, so we put inputs in, we put in training load, we put in food, we put in, you know, this is a very mechanistic way to look at it, but we put in a certain amount of sleep. We make interventions into how we think their menstrual cycle might dictate their training or impact their training. So we make interventions in the training cycle or the strength training or the nutrition to work around that. And this is just another layer. And fundamentally, as coaches, our job is to just have a better and better understanding of this black box problem, so to speak, with a desired outcome. That's what we're doing. But we also have to humbly recognize that it's still a black box, no matter how much science we apply to it. There's still unpredictable outcomes that come out of that system. And that's part of the game. That's why we're here, is to learn together and grow together. So that's the part that's endlessly fascinating to me. I like to think of humans and athletes as fractally complex, right? You keep going deeper and deeper and deeper, and you still get things that happen that are like, huh, that's a head scratcher. I think there's beauty in that. But a question I have for you, Kerry, is, well, first, I just want to back up also and say thank you very much for explicitly explaining and outlining that problem that women athletes have on long training days or during races and dealing with tampons. I think it's great that you just spelled that out point blank. That's gold. A question is, when we're thinking about, now my question has just completely escaped my brain. I lost it. I got too many thoughts going on. Sorry. We'll skip ahead.
Thanks for editing. Thank goodness for editing, right?
Thank goodness for editing. Occasionally the train leaves the station. Yeah, I don't remember where I was going with that, but anyway, we can just go forward. It'll come back to me.
Yeah, that's cool. You had your black box going on.
Yeah. I've got it.
They,
Now it
there we
came
go.
back. Okay. So my question is, like we've spoken about people using contraceptives, obviously because maybe they don't want to have a kid and they're sexually active, but also to manage symptoms of menstrual cycles, right? And on the other side of that, we have athletes who are training so hard, women athletes who are training so hard that they don't have a cycle anymore, right? They no longer have a period. A racing acquaintance of mine, world champion in mountain bike cross country from years ago, her goal every season was to have one period because she was training that hard. So I think, we can talk about white elephants in the room, so to speak, of elite sports, of professional cycling and other sports, biathlon, whatever it may be. I wonder, is there a lot of data out there that tells us how many women are actually menstruating regularly at, we'll say, the world or elite level? Is it really common for women to be training so hard and perhaps dancing in the world of relative energy deficiency syndrome, REDS, that they're not menstruating at all? And what do you think? I mean, to me, this is parallel to or equivalent to a health crisis, really, effectively, in my opinion. With the humble statement that I don't know that much about that world, but I think women, they're like, we're all, as Nathan alluded to, we're all humans who are subject to natural cycles, and this cycle is obviously important to a woman's health. So if she's not having menstruation or menstrual cycles have ceased because of her training level, like, how do you feel about that? And what do you think? Do you have data on what the prevalence of that is at the world level in athletics? Any ideas? Do we know?
Yeah. Yeah, I feel very strongly about this because it shouldn't be happening. And I think the first thing that I would like to say is to just try to encourage everybody to dissociate the idea of amenorrhea, which is the menstrual dysfunction of not having any bleed at all. So just not having your period, basically. Oligomenorrhea would be a more irregular, and then eumenorrhea is that sort of natural rhythm of a pretty much 21 to 35 day, as it's typically defined, menstrual cycle. So just to be clear about that. So you should be having a natural menstrual cycle if you haven't got a kind of diagnosed menstrual dysfunction or issue, like clinical issue. And if you're not using hormonal contraception. And I think that's why I guess I feel quite strongly as well about just jumping onto hormonal contraception, because it masks your natural cycle or lack thereof. So the first thing to say, or that I feel, is that you can train the hardest of any athletes on the planet as a woman, and you should still get your menstrual cycle. So I don't want the message here to be that, and we've got a paper that the title is a quote from one of those senior cross-country skiers that says, and it's what one of the athletes said that her coach had told her, or someone had said to her, do elite sport first, get your period later. We've got another, within that paper, it comes up time and time, or a few times from different athletes saying that I was told by my coach, or I was told by, so I can't remember if it was a coach or it might have been a peer, it might have been a medical doctors say oftentimes, if you're not having your period, it's normal because you're an athlete. That's being normalized by clinicians. Like, that to me is quite disastrous. I feel very strongly about this. Like, what clinician is saying that they don't, and the problem is that they don't understand the context of sport, right? So they just think, oh, they understand the physiological mechanism, and they make 1 and 1 equal, I don't know, 12. But so athletes will be told that by clinicians, but then also, oh, if you're getting your period, you're not training hard enough. So these myths, this is still happening today. Like today, like I could go out and ask 100 athletes at a very high level in endurance, weight-bearing sports, like cycling, like running, like cross-country skiing, aesthetic sports, even worse, pretty much, well, I mean, kind of in the same ballpark. So we're talking gymnastics, synchronized swimming, these kind of things. So very, very high prevalence. Like there's different studies with different kind of numbers, but there's a high prevalence of menstrual dysfunctions within endurance athletes, right? So that the female endurance athletes. So that's the first thing to kind of acknowledge. But I think the second very most important thing is that doesn't need to happen, and it shouldn't happen. And the only reason it does happen is that balance between is energy availability, right? So it's that balance between energy in, like nutrients actually being used properly in the body, and then everything that you're using, like you were talking about, Reds, I mean, everything that you're using for your daily activity, everything, all the activities that you're doing that's using up your energy, and not having enough left over to sustain normal physiological function, right? That is why this occurs. So the only reason for that occurring is you not having the right kind of incoming nutrients to balance your underlying kind of just survival and physiology, the stress going on in your life, the work that you're doing at school or in a job because you're a part-time athlete, all of the training that you're doing. The thing that's going to shut down first is that ability to reproduce, and that's what happens. So that ability to reproduce is going to shut down, meaning that you're not having menstrual cycles. So yeah, I do feel really strongly about it. It is a huge problem still, and myths are getting perpetuated by coaches, peers, parents, clinicians, like all sorts of people involved in elite sport who don't have up-to-date knowledge.
I think I've also, heard many times that some female athletes even see it as some kind of something that they're proud of, or some kind of a trophy that I am pushing myself hard enough. And this is very much a burning the candle at both ends issue, right? If you are putting on the training load and not supplying the body with what it needs, obviously reproduction is the first system that the body will turn off, because it's not essential to our own current survival. So it's the first thing, and it's in many ways, it's similar for men as well, although our symptoms are very different. But Kerry, for me, I feel like we might have to get you on the podcast again and maybe jump in at exactly this point, because it's very fascinating, and I think Colby and I both have a lot of interest and feelings that we would like to share around that. And additionally, and more importantly, learn more from you, because you're very fascinating to talk with. But I think we'll probably have to leave the show here today. So I think we would both just like to thank you so much for coming on board, and also creating a wonderful space for us to ask questions, and feel also safe in asking those questions and not trying to be too embarrassed asking those questions. So thank you for normalizing the table for us here as well.
Thanks both for a really just, productive, open discussion.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor McGawley.
One thing I was thinking, like,
expertise.
one thing I was worried about, like when we were talking, like, because now this could be edited out, but do you think, like, at no point have we talked about the fact that, and I know that it's quite a common myth for athletes, coaches, people who are not really well versed in this. I mean, you guys have obviously educated yourself like to a really good level anyway, just in, even if it's not like the specifics of this, it's like being able to talk about it and things. But the fact that actually there's no evidence that performance does differ across these cycles, because I think you guys probably know quite a bit about this anyway, but we didn't sort of touch on the basics of what a menstrual cycle is and stuff. But there just isn't any, and obviously there's a lot of context to then talking about symptoms and so on, but I just think it's important for listeners to understand from the outset that there's no scientific evidence, like at a group level, to say that we are better and stronger and faster or more powerful in one phase or moment in the menstrual cycle than another. Maybe it's obvious because we did talk about that individuality, and it comes down to individual symptoms and experiences and potentially even performance, but the variation is wild, and the like within individual variation from one cycle to the next looks also very large. So just because you behave in a certain way performance-wise, let's say if you do a VO2 max test or whatever you're going to do, it won't look like the next cycle necessarily. But yeah, we can wrap up. I just wanted to make sure that people have the very basics.
Thank you for mentioning that.
I think we should consider jumping on again into the future. I think this is, we could maybe even just call this part 1 of the conversation with Professor. Sorry, I'll go with Kerry.
Kerry's fine. Yeah.
I think we should consider this part 1. For me, this is, excited a lot of thought. a lot of things that I would actually love to read, especially if you'd like to pass through some of those studies. I had a brief view of some of your abstracts from your studies that you've done, and I already feel like I've learned more as a coach. So thank you for that. And yeah, we look forward to, I guess, speaking again at some point soon in the future.
No, hit me up whenever. Like, I'm always happy to talk, especially to coaches, and in high performance sport, that's kind of my favorite thing. So I'm more than happy to talk anytime. So thanks a lot for the discussion, and just for what you're doing here. I think it's super. You seem to have exactly the best approach to this. So thanks for that.
Thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you for tuning in to the Cycling Performance Podcast. This podcast is produced by myself, Nathan Haas, and Colby Pearce, in association with EF Education and Team EF Coaching, a world leader in cycling coaching for all ages, abilities, and goals. Our world-class team of coaches have won over 100 national titles across all disciplines of cycling, competed in 47 Grand Tours with victories in all 3 and 6 Olympic Games. So it's our goal to distill our experiences to bring you the most cutting-edge approach to cycling to achieve your goals, dreams, and aspirations in our beautiful sport. If you'd like to learn more about Team EF Coaching, find us on Instagram, LinkedIn, or at our website, teamefcoaching.com. We would like to thank Peridur ap Gwyneth from Pendulum for the energetic theme music, and to Ross Hallard, our wonderful editor. Ride in flow, space monkeys.